welcome back to the Osteophysio YouTube channel. So for today's video, carrying on for why are we getting pain in different areas, we are going to be addressing pain and pressure around the sternum, so the chest area. So there's lots of different causes that can cause pain to refer to this area. We are going to be focusing on the most common musculoskeletal conditions that we see in clinic. One of the most common conditions that we see causing pain around this area is something called myalgia, so muscle pain, and we get this a lot when we repeat different activities and different exercises that tighten certain muscle groups that then cause that area to become really painful and sensitive. So we're thinking around the sternum area, we're thinking about the muscles that actually attach into the sternum. So one of the most common two muscles that blend together is your pec minor and your pec major. Your pec minor attaching from up here down into third and fourth ribs around this area, with your pec major over the top being the bigger of the two muscles, blending from the humerus, attaching up into your clavicle, so up into the collarbone, and then blending down into the costocartilages, so down into the top 6 ribs. So it blends right the way down, and if we're being really geeky, it actually has an aponeurosis, so a blending down with the external oblique, so following down. So a huge muscle around this area, so it's responsible for movement of the shoulder, movement of the ribs. It has lots of different functions in the body. So really common triggers of tightness around this area can be anybody from a desk-based job where you're dropping the shoulders forward and it's getting really tight. Anybody with any previous history of any kind of breathing difficulties or conditions, for example, around asthma, COPD. The reason why is you're using the ribs a lot more, so all of these muscles are being used to help with respiration, which can then become fatigued and sore over time. Anybody in physical jobs, if you're constantly lifting or moving the arm forward, it can cause tightness through there. Anybody with any kind of upper body throwing sports, for example, I don't know, javelin, shot put, golf, anything like that where you're using the upper body repetitively. Tennis, badminton, obviously a lot more obvious, can cause tightness through this area. So it in itself doesn't always cause pressure here. What we normally find is if someone's been doing this over and over for a long period of time, you push around this area and it feels really fibrotic, so really tight. So what we would do as osteopaths is we would test and resist the muscles. We would stretch the arm back, probably when you're lying on your back, just to see how it feels and how much movement you have around the front of the shoulder and into the ribs, and we would palpate and test all around here. This brings us nicely onto another musculoskeletal condition that can cause pain around the sternum, is damage and aggravation to the sternocostal joint, so where your ribs blend in and attach into your sternum. There's lots of different causes for this. We can see if someone's, for example, had quite a persistent cough recently or a bit of a cold, so again around winter time, very normal, where they've done a lot of coughing and they might have aggravated through the ribs, through the intercostals. That can sometimes refer into the attachment around the front. We've seen a lot of people with climbing injuries or reaching injuries where they're reaching and stretching up through, and they stretch and pull onto the sternochondral joint, so aggravating the surrounding ligaments, the capsule around the joint. So what we normally find is really kind of pinpoint pain over those joints as we're coming down, and they feel like whenever they use or move the arm, or whether they cough or whether they breathe, this can cause a lot of tenderness around here. So treatment wise can be a little bit of a challenge if it's quite lax around the actual joint itself, or if there's a lot of tenderness. What we would aim to do is regain function, so regain movement around the area. So we would assess by moving with you lying on your back, opening up through the ribs, seeing how it feels when we're palpating down, and then treatment wise we would add movement through all of the rib cage around the back as well, because you think if it's restricted around the back, that's going to put more pressure around the front, so we want to assess the whole of the rib cage. We would then be getting your shoulders moving, relaxing around the pectoral muscles that we spoke about already, and freeing up into the front of the rib cage. Finally, I want to talk about the difference between costochondritis and Teitze syndrome. So although we're talking about sternum pain today, costochondritis, or any damage to the costochondral joints, are a tiny bit more out from the sternum, so it's around this area. But of course, when the pain intensifies around this area, it can of course refer more into the sternum as well. So it's never as clear cut as just one area, it tends to kind of refer out, so definitely relevant for today. So your costochondral joints, like we said, slightly more lateral. One of the most common conditions that can impact these joints are something called costochondritis. If we're thinking of the itis, it's inflammation of the joints. This can be due to trauma, repetitive patterns like we said before, you know, leaning, twisting. I've seen it in pregnant women when they're breastfeeding, you know, constantly dropping forward and putting pressure through the ribs and aggravating. What happens is you get localized tenderness around this area, tightness and pain that tends to refer out again over the sternum, and normally difficulty on breathing or any kind of using of the ribs. So lifting up, you think we're moving the ribs, laughing, talking, breathing tends to cause tenderness over 2, 3, maybe 4 of the joints on or into the rib cage. So what we would look at, although it tends to resolve on its own, we'd be looking at reducing anything that's causing you to drop and cause aggravation through the ribs. And then treatment wise, we'd want to calm it down. So we would normally advise a little bit of ice, a little bit of breathing, so getting you to gently keep the ribs moving, but obviously quality, not quantity initially when it's very sore, as well as movement that we would add in very gently through the ribs, through the shoulder, neck, and then releasing through the diaphragm. So just thinking, although the pain's here, we want to free everything up around so that you can start to use the ribs properly again without causing that soreness. A tiny side note on Teitze syndrome. So Teitze syndrome is incredibly rare. It presents in a very similar way, but also incredibly different. So it tends to impact one of the joints rather than lots of them, and it tends to cause swelling around the joints. And that's a differentiating factor between costochondritis and Teitze syndrome, is you tend to have actual swelling around that specific joint. So again, we would want to get that assessed properly, ruling out any other conditions, and then again it's one that tends to calm down on its own. As a final note, because obviously we're talking about sternal pain today, a lot of people don't realise is that you can actually fracture your sternum. Like any other joint or bone in the body, you can actually fracture this. Again, incredibly rare. It's a very robust bone, a very robust area, based on obviously protecting all of the organs internally. But again, if we're thinking like a car accident, seatbelt injury with high impact trauma can cause a possible fracture through there. Any damage slightly lower down onto the xiphoid process, excessive or really kind of severe coughing potentially. But again, very kind of take that with a pinch of salt, because we're thinking with certain demographics, we'd be thinking, is there any underlying possible osteoporosis where the bones are a little bit more fragile? So everybody's different, everybody's unique, but we'd want to obviously have a look at that. Most people know about it. Most people would have had it x-rayed, you would have had all of this checked. But again, in that latter example, this might be something that we potentially pick up on and obviously send for referral.